Alrighty, we've got about 20 people on today, and so I'm going to jump into it. Thank you all so much for coming to our webinar on how to target for heat pumps. Really excited to get to talk about this today. I'll end our little icebreaker poll, which I only just realized was punnier than I intended, about what type of space heater folks are using now in their homes. Not super surprising. A lot of us, as many Californians, are still using natural gas in our homes, and that's among, probably the biggest group of electrification nerds you could get together in one webinar. But that's true right now across the state, right? That heat pumps are at about a 1% adoption for electric heating, and most people are still using natural gas for space heating, and that's why we're also focused on how do we get folks to stop lighting fossil fuels on fire inside their house to stay warm, because that just sounds so backwards. And then importantly for this webinar, how can we do that, especially early on, in a way that will protect people from having higher energy costs overall through meter-based targeting. And so I will jump into this. I am Mia Oppelstrup. And I work at Recurve. What Recurve does magic with meter data. And I think the most magical part of this is we do it all with open source methods. So any methods I talk about today for targeting are fully open source, available for free to anyone. We help contribute to the development of these methods along with other stakeholder groups, and they are shepherded by the Linux Foundation, the steward of those methods. And so the way that Recurve makes revenue is by packaging them into simple, interactive platforms that help people make decisions about how to use this data. Because when you have energy data, you can quickly get into the billions, if not trillions, of data points. And even though the methods are open source, that can be hard to deal with, but that's Recurve's specialty. We package it all up into a really nice platform. And in addition to our targeting and energy savings insights, on the other half of what we do is we run virtual power plant markets as a service. So all that data goes into letting a utility or a state say, we have this much money to give away, we want this much in grid benefits, and then Recurve's platform lets aggregators get paid for how much of that benefit they deliver to the person running the program. My role at Recurve is working directly with one of our variety of customers. I'm on the customer solutions team. And we work with utilities and aggregators all across the country. And my primary focus is as the main point of contact for technology and equipment for clean heating initiative. It's the really big California initiative for promoting residential heat pump retrofits. And I'm really excited to be part of that. And the methods I'll be talking about here for targeting for electrification are being applied at scale in tech, which is going to be very, very exciting. And I'll also throw out that I'm not speaking officially for the tech initiative, although I support it through my role at Recurve. I'm a very passionate decarbonization advocate, and some of these views, or at least the emphasis on them, may be my own. Okay, so why do we care about this? Why do we care about analyzing everyone's meter data to do targeting for who we reach out to about electrification? And the reason we should care, the reason I care so much, is that electrification retrofits are a funny thing. They're very different than almost any other energy efficiency retrofit I've thought about in the past, because of the difference in natural gas cost and electricity cost per unit of energy, because electricity costs more per unit of energy. Switching a use from cheap natural gas over to electricity can result in higher overall energy costs for some customers with current fuel cost rates. And that is with assuming perfect installation and perfect equipment performance and absolutely no change in behavior at all whatsoever. And I'm sure we all know how unlikely all of those factors are to come together at once. But even assuming everything goes perfectly, you can end up in a situation where, as is shown in this very high level distribution of the outcomes of total annual energy costs after a heat pump retrofit for HVAC, you can end up paying more to heat and cool your home by doing the same thing you were doing before. And we really want to avoid recruiting folks who we can easily see ahead of time from their meter data, really likely to end up in this group. Because electrification is still at a very early stage right now. Like I was saying before, we're at 1% adoption. We are at the equivalent of where electric cars were 10 years ago. And there was maybe a Nissan Leaf and a very expensive Tesla Roadster, and everyone thought they were weird. And so we really have to make sure that the early adopters are folks who are going to have good overall experiences and want to tell their neighbors and their friends how great heat pumps are, so that we can keep the momentum going until we get to the point where rates are a little bit more fair towards electrification. So to start off, I am going to do a little bit of an exercise with everybody here. So we're going to have another poll. And when I first gave this, let me see if I can stop sharing this one and launch my next poll. Okay, great. So you're going to graph yourself, so to speak. It won't show up physically on the graph, but you're going to think about where on this graph you would land. And fill out the poll based off that. When I first presented the findings from this paper at a conference, I made everyone in the room gather all their belongings and stand up and graph themselves physically in the room. So it's definitely one thing that's easier to do virtually, although it was fun to make everybody schlep around. Okay, cool. We'll give people a couple more seconds to fill that out. So make sure if you are here on the webinar that you have selected what kind of space heating and cooling user you are. Great. Okay, got just about everyone, at least 85% of all participants. I'm going to go ahead and, oh, we got one more. Last chance. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end that poll and share the results. Okay, and you can start to see where folks have landed. And so most people are in that kind of like low group. And then we have some distribution across the rest of the groups as well. And the next step in my little scenario here in this activity is that I am now making you all low-income households. And this is a pretty realistic scenario, right? In California, especially, 25% of households are energy insecure. There can be months where they're not sure if they can keep the lights on and keep the gas on. And there's months where making rent comes down to a matter of less than $50. And I know from experience that this is a realistic scenario because I grew up in a low-income household in California. And I thought my childhood was totally awesome and wasn't really, aware of the economics. But my mom, who raised me and my two sisters as a single mom, she told me as an adult that there were months where she cleared the rent check and there was 1 cent left in her bank account. That's how closely she managed every single dollar. And so putting us in that mindset and that perspective, you can understand why it's so critical that as electrification moves forward and we try to make it equitable by recruiting lower income customers, we are very cognizant of what the bill impacts can be. Because even if you have an amazing direct install program that pays all upfront costs, for example, you could really still end up hurting people very badly if you start messing with margins that are this low. So in our scenario, you're now all low income households, and we have given you all heat pumps. We've replaced any cooling or heating that you had in your house with a clean, super efficient heat pump that performs perfectly to its listed coefficient of performance on the faceplate. And we are going to figure out who makes rent over the winter. And I'm being a little bit, flippant, using some humor here, but really having come from this background and working in this field, it's extremely important to me that we take this, that we apply this, and we believe this, and we understand how this all works. So I'll be using humor as a tool here with the intention of getting this to stick so we can make it work for folks. Okay, so let's go through the different scenarios. If you are in my super cooler group, which looks like it was about 28% of you, can raise your hand using the raise hand function. You come out way ahead. This is awesome for you. Great, I see some hands raised there. Yeah, so you are a low-income household who was probably stuck with some really crappy, inefficient air conditioner. Maybe you live somewhere just really hot in the summer, and you just have to run the AC to stay remotely comfortable and healthy and safe. But maybe it's more mild in the winter, so you're not using a lot of gas heating. And so that super efficient heat pump by default gave you a much more efficient air conditioner. You saved a lot of money on air conditioning over the summer. And you had a little bit higher heating costs in the winter, but nowhere near as much as you had saved in the summer. And you really weren't spending that much on heating in the winter anyway, so it pretty much doesn't affect you too badly in the winter, and you really come out ahead and tell your friends, this is great. And then we're going to go to my high cooling, high heating, the both high group, which looks like it was about 16% of us. You can go ahead and raise your hand in the raise hand function. And so this, you still got those savings in the summer because you were really just spending a lot of money on AC. You might live somewhere where it's hot and humid, maybe in the summer, you have to run it all the time. But maybe it's also cold in the winter. So you're also having to heat a lot to stay safe and comfortable in the winter. And so, you saved a lot in the summer, you're super happy about it. But it kind of pushed your winter monthly margins a little bit over, and that made a couple of winter months tough. Maybe you had to put money on a credit card, which has a high interest rate. That kind of sucks because you're low income, you don't have a lot of access to cheap capital, you don't have a HELOC at 4% laying around. And so you come out ahead overall throughout the year, and it's overall a good thing for you, and you're happy that you can use a healthier form of heating in your home for your kids. And then we're going to go to the low cooling, low heating group. Not a lot changed for you. You don't really care because you weren't really using your heater that much in the winter, and you weren't really using your AC that much. You probably live somewhere very, very mild with maybe a very well insulated house, and just not that big of a deal for you. But this isn't a great program outcome, right? Because the program still spent a lot of money, time, and effort getting you engaged, getting you to respond. Maybe you even had to take unpaid time off of work, so you don't have a great leave policy, which a lot of low-income people are facing, that kind of situation, for the install. And so even if the install costs were covered, this had a cost to you. It's kind of annoying. And you tell your friends like, I don't know, this whole heat pump thing is kind of maybe a waste of time. And that's not a great outcome for the program. And then we have folks in our low cooling, high heating, our superheater group. And in this particular audience, we only had one person who fell into this category. But while they have great greenhouse gas savings, because they reduced a whole bunch of natural gas usage, in terms of bill impacts and for a low income family, this is the worst case scenario, because you had much, much higher heating costs all winter. All that heating that you have to do is now switched over to your electricity bill. And you don't care that it's using fewer joules of energy. You're paying more money that you didn't have. And you don't get to catch up in the summer because you weren't really using your AC anyway. But maybe you just live somewhere with really cold winters and you have to run a lot of heat so your family doesn't freeze. And this really sucks. And this is what can lead us to having very bad outcomes, getting covered in the daily news. Because, you know, my previous background before analytics was in marketing, and a common saying was, a happy customer will tell 5 of their friends, but an unhappy customer will tell 500 of their friends and get on the local news and say how much your product or your program hurt them. And we really cannot afford that in electrification. These families can't afford it. It's unethical for us to let this happen. If we have the meter data to look at, to find out which of these groups folks are in and find those super coolers, everything we can to engage and help them, and avoid actively reaching out to people who will actually be hurt by this intervention under current rate realities. Okay, so how do we go about that? How do we go about finding more of those super coolers and less of the super heaters who would have, just, we know from the outset, very low chance of having a good electrification retrofit experience? And so this is where we're going to start getting into some methods. And so the data I'll be presenting today is from a study that Recurve was able to do in partnership with a CCA in Northern California. And it was East Bay Clean Energy provided meter data for a full year for over 350,000 residential customers. And we were also able to get the monthly gas data that they had for each one of those customers as well. And we used all of our open source methods to disaggregate that usage and understand at a high level how much of it was going towards cooling and how much of the natural gas usage was going towards heating. And then our partners at Ardena Energy, namely Bruce Mast, helped run some high-level electrification cost analysis of, you know, okay, if folks are in this high-low bucket of heating and cooling, where are they likely to land, you know, in a rough estimate in terms of savings. And I would want to emphasize that the focus here was really to understand how much those two factors of electric cooling and gas heating can vary, and how much the potential outcomes of bill impacts from electrification can vary. We were really not trying to get to a super precise model of the exact energy outcomes and dollar values. As I mentioned before, we were making some very generous assumptions about perfect equipment performance. So we just wanted to say, you know, if everything goes well with the installation, the best case scenario, what's a high level range of impacts? And part of that is because the tech initiative will be getting real metered exact dollar value and GHG impacts for the actual program itself. So this is just more of a high level. How much variation is there? What's the potential risk to recruiting people without doing this type of targeting? And talking about the methods that we use, so I've mentioned that they're Open source. CalTRACK essentially is a method that helps you feed in meter data and learn how does that customer respond to changes in temperature outside, changes in weather, and then some other factors that could be pulled in for hourly models around, weekly occupancy patterns. But we are just going to focus on the simplest version of CalTRACK, the monthly model, that tries to understand, how steeply do you respond to changes in weather and energy? Because, for someone like me, I'm cold all the time. I'm in California and I'm sitting here with a blanket on my lap to give this webinar. And so I respond very severely to cold temperature, but not very much to warm temperature because I like being warm. Whereas my neighbor could live in the exact same house type, same insulation and the same number of people, but have a very different usage breakout of heating and cooling because maybe they run hot and they need to run their AC almost all the time and they barely ever use their heater. That's why it's so important for each meter to be analyzed separately for usage and not to just go by averages or climate zones or building type, because they really only tell half the story. And in terms of what CalTRACK is designed to measure as a whole method, it can do a lot. So like I said, it can learn how a customer responds to temperature in the baseline period. And then for program interventions, like what we will be doing in the future for tech, when a heat pump is installed, for instance, it can use how it learned you respond to temperature and other factors and project out how you would have kept using energy as a counterfactual or business as usual case after the heat pump was installed. And then we can compare that to your actual observed usage and understand impact, the difference, what changed because of the program, the intervention, or the heat pump that was installed or that you participated in. But what we'll be focusing on for today is actually just the simplest part of CalTRACK. We're just looking at results from that learning period in the baseline of understanding how are people using energy now, before we even start doing a single dollar of outreach or send a single email. Who are those folks that we should definitely reach out to and definitely not reach out to? It's a question we want to answer. And how we do this is that we get all of your, messy meter data, and CalTRACK helps us understand how it correlates to outdoor temperature. And we find the point at which the balance points for heating and cooling that, okay, that's where this particular person gives in and turns on the heater, or gives in, it's too hot and they turn on the AC. And we end up fitting your usage to one of 4 models. Maybe we sense that there's sensitivity to both hot and cold temperature. So that would be, like our both high group, who responded, about 16% of this audience. There's a point at which it gets cold enough that they will turn on their heater. And there's a point at which it gets hot enough very regularly that they turn on their AC. And so we're going to end up seeing a heating load and a cooling load for them that is above their base load usage. Whereas you might have folks who have just a heating load, that would kind of be on our superheater group. These are the folks who really don't want to do a bunch of active outreach about heat pumps on a purely based on the bill outcomes basis right now. And then we have our super coolers. All you super coolers, this is your basic usage pattern where you might not have a ton of response to cold temperatures, might not get very cold where you live, but you certainly use a decent amount of AC. You probably live somewhere fairly hot with mild winters. And then there's our baseload users who are our kind of both low, which was actually the biggest portion of this audience. Under this, more simplified model, you just have a baseload of your always on and non-space heating, non-space cooling loads from the monthly model. And so what we did with that was we figured out how many people end up in each of the gas bins and electric bins. And so these are each split up into 20 percentile bins. The higher up you are on the gas bin, the more gas heating you're using in the winter. Higher up you are on the electric bin, the more electric cooling that you're using in the summer. And we really wanted to understand how much variation is there between the combination of these factors, because it's the combination of those factors that's so important for your likely bill outcomes for an electrification retrofit for HVAC. And I thought the results were absolutely fascinating. So for instance, in the lowest cooling bins, these are people who quite frankly didn't have AC. Either they don't have AC or they don't use it. There's no detectable response to hot temperatures in their usage. And they ran the gamut in the full range of gas usage. So you could have somebody with virtually no air conditioning usage who is using very little natural gas heating, to somebody who's all the way at the top bin using 600 plus therms per year to heat their home. And each one of those scenarios would have very different electrification bill outcomes. And on the other end of the spectrum, people who are in the highest cooling bin here, so they have the highest potential to save on cooling by having perhaps an inefficient air conditioning system replaced by an efficient heat pump. And we still see quite a lot of range, although not as evenly distributed among their gas usage. And these two folks are kind of that ideal group, the supercoolers. In this particular audience, it was 28% of people, but in the ones we analyzed with their meter data, it was only about 5% of people. And you can think, gosh, that sounds so low, it's not even worth reaching out to. But let's flip that around and think about the fact that California is at 1% heat pump adoption right now. If we got all of these people to electrify, we would have increased heat pump adoption by 5 times, 500%, and still only be taking off the very, very cream of the crop of people who have the most possible potential bill savings to realize by reducing super inefficient AC usage and only having to transfer over a modest amount of gas heating to their electric bill. And like I said before, no, that's not the best greenhouse gas savings outcome, but with current fuel costs, these are the folks who can really save on their bills. I mean, especially again, as we think about wanting to do electrification equitably and make sure that we don't want to leave low-income people stranded on an expensive gas system, right? We want to help them electrify earlier. Maybe we can even do direct install type programs, but still in the next few years, as we are, still dealing with rates that favor natural gas, quite frankly, I think that we have a strong moral obligation, if we have any way to access meter data, to find these folks and really, really focus our engagement and our outreach to them, both because we're spending ratepayer money in a lot of cases, and because if you're recruiting a low-income family into a heat pump retrofit program can have negative bill impacts, even with perfect behavior and perfect installation, if we don't think about this ahead of time. Okay, and so these are our overall outcomes. This is the same slide as I showed initially, but now you have a little bit more context. So we found that for the majority of folks, it ended up being about 3/4. They had either negative savings or such low savings, $40 a year, that you're really just getting into false accuracy there, and you really can't say that that's a good candidate, to spend a lot of outreach dollars trying to recruit them when, focusing on these 25% of folks who have a real bill savings potential is far well beyond the number of people we need to reach out to fill every low-income heat pump program that will be doing recruitment and spending money for the next several years. So we can safely do this even with what I kind of think of as like the worst case scenario of our current rate structures of gas being so much cheaper per unit of energy than electricity. And again, we were making some very optimistic assumptions about how every heat pump would perform perfectly to spec, and there would be no changes at all to the building envelope or to behavior, to once again get a very high level analysis. If you just switched out a heat pump right now and everything went great, like, could there be people who don't come out ahead? And the answer is yes. So it's a really big lesson to look for these folks. Okay, and so the takeaways here are that we really can find the people who are the best electrification candidates right now. You can do it with open source methods that are available for free to everyone. Getting the meter data, I think, can be the hardest part of this, and any of my colleagues from the tech initiative who are joining can empathize with that. But if you have a way to get meter data, I think that we as electrification experts and implementers and advocates have a responsibility to use these tools to just check to see, are you in the definitely don't reach out group? Are you in the definitely reach out group? These are really, really big signals in the data. We're not looking for anything subtle. Using, like I said, the simplest version of CalTRACK and the simplest piece of it, just the baselining piece. And so you just need 1 year of meter data for your population. And we can find folks who are super coolers and reach out to them. So we can go for this headline for our industry, that people are saving money. We can find those people who really are suffering from ridiculous cooling burdens, often spending, from what I've seen in the data, 40+% of their annual electricity usage just to stay cool. And we could find them and recruit them into our heat pump programs, save them lots of money, keep them comfortable, and whatever small amount of heating they do have to do will be safer and healthier. And we can keep all of this moving forward in the short term as equitably as possible, while continuing to push for broader reform for rates overall. So that is my summary, and super happy that everybody was able to join today. I'm not sure if we had any questions come up. It looks like there was one question about whether we get access to the slides. Yes, certainly. We'll be posting the slides. And if you found this helpful today, if you found anything here surprising, please reshare Recurve's LinkedIn post about this webinar, so that, and tell folks to follow Recurve on LinkedIn to get the recording. Because if you found anything here interesting, the 25 people on the webinar live right now are probably some of the most committed decarbonization advocates and the biggest geeks who really know about all of these nuances. And so if you found anything even remotely surprising, it would be extremely helpful for anybody who's perhaps less engaged in the nuance of electrification impacts to hear some of this. So please make sure to reshare that post from LinkedIn, and tell folks to follow Recurve to get the recording. I think this is just super, super important that all of us program influencers here think about how to do electrification in an equitable and fair way, and that we use these tools and data that are now becoming more and more available to us. Okay, great. I will leave it to one more minute in case we get any other questions coming in. And I will see if I can post that LinkedIn page in the chat. But thank you all so much for joining today. Oh, Jenny Lowe, because you work closely with tech, Does this mean they will be using meter data in this manner or conducting research on how to target best residents for heat pump adoption? Absolutely, tech will be doing that. Tech will have the most robust targeting data set, I believe, that has ever been put together. I'm personally overseeing the massive amount of engineering work being done to analyze about 4 trillion data points from all the IOUs and a couple of the municipal utilities to understand what the population looks like in terms of how they actually use energy in their home and what percentage of people are good candidates for electrification. And then working as closely as we can with partners through tech to try to put that targeting into action. Angelo also asked, that was a great question, Jenny. Thank you so much. And then Angelo asked, would you be recording a similar webinar where the target audience is more of the non-geek people who pretty much just want to understand the numbers in their own terms? I would love to do that if we can figure out how to get non-heat pump geek people to attend a webinar on electrification targeting. Definitely think about that. But also please do share this on LinkedIn, and I hope that the interactive exercises and scenarios can help just about anybody understand why targeted outreach is important, especially if they're just focusing on, perhaps recommend just the first 10 minutes or so of the webinar recording when it becomes available. We had another person to say, is the ultimate goal to use the data to advocate for rate reform? We personally won't be doing advocacy for rate reform, but we're going to be making as much of our results public as possible while keeping it aggregated and very carefully protecting any underlying PII, so that many people will have access to this data. Researchers, super users who we're engaging with and interviewing ahead of the release of any publication. So I really recommend following along all the data tech is producing at techcleanca.com, because they've already published a lot about just the number of installs that have gone in, how much they've cost, and how many have gone in over time through the program. And through Recurve's research, eventually later next year, we'll be able to start layering in some of those metered impacts and some of our insights about our population analysis of state, which I am very excited about. And Bob Ramirez asked, will you be using the AMI data to characterize the HVAC systems themselves? No AC, gas furnace, central heat pump, electric furnace. We'll certainly be able to see whether or not people had AC before getting heat pump or not, and how that impacted grid resiliency in terms of changes to peak usage in the summer, how that impacted greenhouse gas savings outcomes and everything. But we won't be using it to characterize, say, the difference between their HVAC system before getting a heat pump. Of course, once they get a heat pump, we get lots of information about the actual heat pump installation project through the tech application, and we'll certainly be slicing and dicing and analyzing how that affected the outcomes and the savings and the value to the grid. Jenny Lowe also asked, are the utilities / tech talking with cities about this? Asking because cities are starting to roll out equitable existing building electrification policies and plans. That is a really great question that I would probably refer to the stakeholder policy experts on the tech team. But Jenny, I'd love it if you would email me, amia@recurve.com, so that I can forward it to the right people and help you engage with them, because I think that's a really good question, especially as a former city planning nerd. Another anonymous question, for the tech data, how far down will the identification of excellent candidates go for heat pumps? That's a really good question. So our main restriction, of course, is consumer privacy. But what's great is that we are working directly with the utilities. So we should be able to tell utilities, and we are actively working to do this, for instance, already with SCE, where we can give them a list of, here are the 8,000 people whose doors you should knock on for your next ESA direct install heat pump project. And SCE is super excited to have this data, and they've been an amazing partner on that. So we're excited to kind of scale that approach if possible. But as far as publicly, we have to follow very strict aggregation rules. So it may be by zip code, but we also have to look at, how many people of each usage subtype are in a zip code, and make sure we're always aggregating any usage we publish to the appropriate number of folks to protect privacy. Angelo asked, how much of the innovations that Recurve is proposing is impacted by regulations within different states, and how do we plan to overcome these challenges? Our policy team has an amazing presentation on, where different states and utilities are in the pathway to, meter-based insights and savings. So I would love to refer you to them. Angelo, if you could email me, I would love to kind of get you connected with the policy team, or perhaps share a deck on that. That's a great question. Perry Grossman. Also, I'm curious about different home types and home energy efficiency measures and different climates. For example, California versus Massachusetts, where I am also super curious about that. So tech will be focusing, of course, on just California data, because that's what we have right now. And the data we'll have about home types will be limited for the broad population. But as much of that as we can get into with the differences in climate and how much variation in heating and cooling there can be in one climate zone, I think will be a really important takeaway. Because you saw just from today, this study, it was 350,000 households, which is really robust, but it still was from one very small geographic area, just in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is a very mild climate and not that varied. There were some warmer areas and some more modern areas, but not that varied. And we still saw a huge range in heating and cooling usage. So you can only imagine how much more extreme that gets in, states that actually have seasons. To make fun of Californians a little bit as somebody born and raised in California. Bob said, thank you so much for joining. And Perry pointed out that gas bans are also coming up in some regions, and that will increasingly be a dynamic. Yes, and something else that I think is really, really important for pushing rate reform and understanding how individual customers can be affected by living in an all-electric home in terms of rate design. But of course, the gas bans are a little bit more for new construction and a little bit further out. So I have faith that from the data I've seen, actually I don't have faith at all. I have data that supports that that can overall be a much better outcome when the whole home is electrified to begin with and built to more modern codes. Bob Ramirez asked if we will be creating a flag for all electric homes. So that's a really, really interesting question. Of course, we will certainly be analyzing homes that have gone all electric in HVAC and water heating, and understanding the full impact of that usage through tech. But I don't know if I'll necessarily be able to confirm that their gas hookup was removed unless the contractor information provided to us includes that, which sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Because what I can tell from the data is I can tell if you are using your gas system, but I can't tell if you necessarily had one sitting there that you weren't personally using. So that's a really good question, and we'll be doing our best to understand how the impacts of heat pumps can range based off of how electric you go, how much you electrify. Hugh said thank you, and thank you so much for coming. Really, really appreciate everybody who was able to join today. And again, if you found any of this surprising, then lots more people could learn from it, because you're really, the experts in this field if you're attending a webinar on electrification, targeting, and meter data. So please do reshare the post about this webinar from Recurve, and tell folks to follow Recurve on LinkedIn to get the recording, because I really want to make sure that as we roll out this early stage of electrification retrofits, we do it as ethically as possible, and we have as positive of an impact on the lives of individual consumers as we can. And if we really owe it to folks to try to do that. Okay. Looks like we are quieting down a little bit. We'll probably wrap this up shortly here. I will just see if I can get that post link. Okay. Here's the Recurve LinkedIn post directly. So please do go ahead and share that if you found anything in here helpful or interesting, or especially if you found anything even a little bit surprising, because if you found it surprising, virtually everyone else in electrification could learn from what we covered today here. So we really appreciate you helping to get this message out, and just really want to emphasize again that these are open source methods. The CalTRACK methods are all open source, and Recurve has even coded them up into the EE meter, which is a piece of open source free software that you can use to run the methods. And so if you're able to get a hold of meter data, this can even be done with just monthly meter data, monthly or daily. It does not have to be AMI data necessarily, because we're looking for such big variations in signals of usage that vary so much with weather and temperature outside. You can get a really good idea of just who to reach out to at all versus who really not to reach out to at all when you're optimizing for bill impacts, and especially critical for any kind of low income program outreach, that we do this the right way, and we spend our ratepayer dollars reaching out to the people who will actually benefit, who really do need the heat pump, because they are suffering from those, really outsized cooling burdens, and they have an unhealthy gas heater, but they're not necessarily using it a ton right now. Those are the folks I think we can make the biggest impact for overall. Okay, great. Well, I think with that, we can wrap up a little bit early. And thank you all so much for coming. I love getting to talk about this. If you have any follow-up questions, please email me, and I'll either answer, or I can get you in touch with the right people at Recurve or in the Tech Initiative, which includes dozens of really awesome partner organizations focusing on everything from contractor training to multifamily to low income. And I can get you to the expert who's really embedded in the field. And I'm sure they would love to hear from you as well.